Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for coming. It's great to be back physically in person, finally. Welcome to this evening's program at the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm pleased to be here on stage in the beautiful headquarters. This is a place I like to call a temple to ideas, to welcome both our in-person and online audiences for tonight's program. My name is Ken Broad. I'm a founding member of Jackson Square Partners, an investment firm located right here in San Francisco. I'm a longtime and proud supporter of the Commonwealth Club, and particularly pleased the club has partnered with the University of Southern California and the Dornsife Center for the Political Future to promote this particular program. So a big shout out to those tuning in remotely from LA. As a longtime fan of the Commonwealth Club and advocate for its civic mission to convene the community on important issues, I am delighted the club has returned to hosting in-person public programs on a regular basis. So I encourage you all to check out the programming and learn more about upcoming offerings at www.commonwealthclub.org. And it's literally every week there's stuff that you'd want to come to. And my wife reminds me, we still have kids, you know that, right, at home. Tonight's featured speaker is political scientist Francis Fukuyama. Dr. Fukuyama is the Olivier Nomalini, Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and a faculty member at the FSI Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. He is also director of Stanford's Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy. Dr. Fukuyama has written widely on issues in development and international politics, and he joins us tonight to talk about his new book, Liberalism and Its Discontents, which builds on his prior book on identity. There's broad consensus that liberal democracy is under attack or in retreat in many parts of the world. It is being contested not just by authoritarian states like China and Russia, but also by populists who have been elected in many democracies that seemed secure. Why is this happening? What has the combination of unbridled neoliberalism, identitarian politics, and social media wrought? And how do we return to the classical form of liberalism? Dr. Fukuyama is one of the most recognized thinkers on the long historical arc of liberalism and democracy, and he will share his critique of liberalism in conversation with political consultant and writer Tim Miller. Tim is a writer at Bulwark. I know we are in for a truly fantastic and supremely relevant conversation this evening. One final note before welcoming the speakers to the stage. We will be taking your questions for Dr. Fukuyama tonight. If you're here on site, please write your questions on a card and it'll be brought up to the stage. And if you're watching online, please put your questions in the YouTube chat box and those questions will be forwarded to Tim. So with that, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Francis Fukuyama and Tim Miller to the stage.
Hey everybody, it's so good to be with you in person. I missed the week-to-weeks here at the Commonwealth Club and seeing everybody. It is really nice to be back. Thanks to Ken for his support of this conversation. My name's Tim Miller. I'm a writer for The Bulwark, as Ken mentioned. I also have a book coming out, Why We Did It, about why people who knew better went along with Trump. It's pre-order now, just saying. I don't know that it's up to the level of the book that we're going to be speaking about tonight, but I think you'll enjoy it. I am so excited and honored to be able to moderate this conversation with Frank, who I've long admired. And I appreciated the opportunity to read this book to kind of refresh my memory about some of the political science and political philosophy classes that I may or may not have skipped while I was at George Washington University. And so I feel very prepared for this. It's extremely timely, and I'm excited to be here with you.
Well, great to be here. I just wanted to point out I'm wearing a Ukrainian baseball cap with the Ukrainian trident. I'm now going to take it off, although I realize that it's actually quite helpful in shielding me from those bright lights, but just in politeness to the Commonwealth Club, I'm.
And I had just purchased a Slava Ukraine sweatshirt, which I would have worn had you told me that to be in theme tonight, but also very relevant. I want to get to Ukraine and some politics at the end. Just one more reminder, if you have questions, if you don't like my questions, write them on the cards, and I'm happy to take some advice from our esteemed audience. I want to start first. The book is Liberalism and Its Discontents. So I would like to start the conversation by defining our term, specifically liberalism as a, for those of you that don't know, I'm a kind of former never Trump Republican type. So as a college Republican growing up, liberal was a dirty word for me. You know, it meant all of these San Francisco tax hiking tree huggers. And then as I've come to read your book over the past 24 hours, I was like, actually, I think liberalism is the opposite of a dirty word. Turns out I might be a liberal, but over in Europe, obviously an opposite definition. So when we talk about the discontents of liberalism, what are you talking about specifically?
Sure, no, that's very important because I definitely don't mean it in that American sense. I mean it in the sense of the doctrine that really got its start in the middle of the 17th century after the European wars of religion. At that point, Europeans had been killing each other for about 150 years over whether they were Protestant or Catholic or what sect of Protestantism. And at that point, a number of thinkers said, well, maybe we shouldn't actually be killing ourselves over, you know, these concepts of the good life and lower the horizons of politics to life itself and to protect, you know, each citizen in their, you know, personal security and agree to disagree. And, you know, that's a doctrine that is associated with certain institutions, the most important of which is a rule of law. These are rules that protect individuals from state power and limit you know, what executive authorities can do through constitutional checks and balances. And it, you know, is really designed to enable individuals to exercise choice, moral choice, autonomy. You know, that's what gives them dignity. Liberalism says we're all equal human beings universally because we do have this capacity for moral choice. And that's really what the government needs to protect. It's not associated with a particular economic policy. So on the right, you know, you have libertarianism, which is not what I consider liberalism. That's kind of funny, uniquely American anti-government, you know, attitude on you know, economic and social issues. It's not, yeah, the center-right version in Europe is like the German Free Democrats that are kind of pro-market but socially more liberal. That's not my version either. So as far as I'm concerned, Sweden, a social democratic state, is a liberal state because they protect individual rights, they respect the rule of law, and you know, that's really, I think, the essence of liberalism for me.
So you're really breaking it down to a few attributes, and when we're talking about rule of law, a democratic republic, but you also talked about some other attributes, you know, kind of the scientific method, you know, other elements of a liberal society. Like what are some of them?
Well, that's particularly important now in the internet age because liberalism was highly associated with a certain cognitive mode called modern natural science. So modern natural science assumes that there is an objective reality that's outside of our subjective consciousnesses. It can be apprehended through something called the scientific method, and that apprehension can be used to manipulate the world, and that's really what creates not just science, but the technology that flows from science. And you know, our modern economic world would not exist but for that technology. And so, you know, that cognitive mode is very much embedded in, you know, the liberal approach.
Well, so I want to get into the discontents on the right and left. But before we do that, one of the things, I think it was in the introduction to the book that I felt was interesting and timely for what we're going through now here is, as you assessed it, the threats that we face to liberalism are actually more acute maybe than the threats to democracy, right? And, we spent a lot of time talking about the threats to democracy. I'm sure we'll have more here at the club. Obviously what we saw on January 6th, we were on a panel together about that. But your point, as I take it, is basically that you know, democracy is not necessarily a protection from illiberalism, right? There are demagogic right. Democratic winners. So talk about how, as you kind of do a threat assessment right now, compare the threats
Sure.
facing the liberal order versus democratic order?
Yeah, so liberalism and democracy are usually allies, and they usually support one another, but they're distinct phenomena. So liberalism is really about law and legal constraints against the abuse of power. Democracy is the legitimation of power through reference to the people, and governments ought to reflect the will of the largest number of their citizens. And although the two support each other in what we call liberal democracy, they can also be separated. And so Viktor Orban in Hungary had announced a number of years ago that he's trying to build not a liberal democracy but an illiberal democracy, meaning he's democratically legitimated. He just won a big election. He got a pretty good majority in parliament. So there's no question that he's democratically legitimate, but he's undermining the independent press in Hungary. He's undermining the court system. He's fostering a system of corrupt cronyism, and all of that reflects the erosion of the rule of law. On the other hand, you can have a country like Singapore, or maybe, Imperial Germany in the 19th century that actually does have a strong rule of law. They respect property rights and permit individual freedoms, but they're not democratic. They don't hold elections. I think that the reason I wrote about liberalism being under threat rather than democracy is that these days, almost nobody contests the principle of democracy, that the people's will should be sovereign. Even the Chinese.
Even Putin claims to be
claim,
democratic.
I mean, he pays homage, hypocritically to democracy by holding, fake elections, but he still holds them. And the Chinese Communist Party say they represent the true democracy because they're really representing the will of the Chinese people. But people don't like liberalism in the first instance, and they attack those legal constraints. That's what every populace in the world, Modi in India, Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, and our Donald Trump here in the United States, all get elected, and the first thing they do with that mandate is to try to undermine the rule of law. And that's why I think that it's really liberalism that's the first victim. Now, once you undermine the rule of law, then you can go after democracy,
Right.
which is what you're now seeing, in Hungary itself. There's a lot of gerrymandering. In our country, something similar is going to happen. If federal judges are not going to stand in the way of election manipulation, then, Republicans are going to manipulate elections. So the two of them are related, but they're not identical.
So I want to get into the critiques of our liberal right and left here, but first, just maybe try to put on the hat, which you do, I think, in the book of what are the legitimate grievances with liberalism that is sort of undermining this illiberal movement on each side, and how would you assess
Before we
that?
get into
Sure,
that, can I tell you what's good about liberalism?
Okay, I was going to end with what's good, but we can start with what's good if you want. Okay.
Let's start with what's good, because I think it's kind of a baseline from which you can then measure what's not so good.
Okay, great.
All right.
Yeah.
So I really think there's three issues. Very simply, there's a pragmatic issue, there's a moral issue, and there's an economic issue. So the pragmatic issue is very simple. As I said, it's a way of dealing with diversity. In a diverse society, if you have a system that stresses tolerance for people that have different opinions from yourself, then it's a way of managing violent conflict. And so it starts out managing the conflict between different types of Christians. In the 19th and 20th centuries, it's an antidote to out-of-control nationalism. And in that respect, it's very good if you're coming out of two big world wars that have destroyed European civilization. Liberalism looks pretty good to you. Or if you're living under communism, a communist dictatorship, again, having the freedom to come and go and speak your mind, looks pretty good. So that's pragmatic. The second is moral, because liberalism is really about human choice. And I think that it's something that is pretty universal among human beings. They don't like to be ordered around. They like to be able to decide, what they're going to do in life, who they're going to marry, where they're going to live, these basic freedoms. But it's more than that, because liberalism going all the way back to the book of Genesis, what makes human beings uniquely human in that Judeo-Christian tradition is their capacity for moral choice. They can choose right or wrong, and that elevates them up, above the rest of nature. And so by protecting the ability to choose, liberalism protects this fundamental human quality, and that's what makes liberals think that all human beings are actually equal, because we may differ by skin color, intelligence, height, all sorts of things, but we all are moral creatures, underneath that. Final thing is economics, because liberalism protects property rights and freedom to transact, and so it's historically been associated with prosperity, with modern economic growth and the like. So I just want to say, it's important to hit the good points.
That's before you hit the critique.
We've been getting a lot of critiques lately.
Okay, that's fair. I want to one-up you, actually, then. Well, let's start about the positives of liberalism, because you sort of expressed towards the end of the book that one of your concerns about, I think one of the critiques of liberalism is the sense that it doesn't foster a sense of community, and that's a lot of. But as I was reading that, I was thinking to myself, is that really true? I don't know. The second, your second point, this moral component, this component that everyone has this individual dignity, when put together into a broad, diverse society, I think there is this sort of communal sense, right? That maybe we don't agree on every specific thing, or maybe our backgrounds aren't exactly the same. We grew up, but we have this one thing in common, which is that we all want, to flourish, and that we all want everybody to succeed. I'm just imagining here in San Francisco, you're sitting in Dolores Park on a Sunday afternoon, like I was doing on Sunday, and there's all kinds of people, all races, and I think everybody in that park does feel like that there's some connective tissue. We've all chosen to be here in this free country. And so I wonder sometimes why advocates of liberalism aren't that good at kind of making the case for the communal nature of it.
Yeah, I think the problem is that it's not one community, it's many communities, right? So liberal societies produce a very variegated and healthy and vigorous civil society.
Right.
But, there are people doing all sorts of things, they're environmentalists, they're feminists, they're trade unionists, they're stamp collectors, there's all sorts of people, and, that is an aspect of our human freedom, to be able to join with other people voluntarily to pursue passions and interests that we share. But I think that for many people, that's not enough, that they would like to actually see a stronger sense of a broader community where people, share more than just these hobbies and, kind of interests, but religious views or, a sense of national purpose. And I actually do think you can see that in Ukraine right now. You've got
this is where I was going to go now.
Yeah, you got this unbelievable degree of national unity right now. So something like 250,000 Ukrainians that had been living in other parts of Europe have actually gone back to Ukraine after the war started so that they could fight, on behalf of their country. And that's something that, frankly, you don't get. That degree of civic spiritedness and engagement is certainly not, and even in our country, I think it's deteriorated. One thing I remember reading Dean Acheson's autobiography many years ago when I was a graduate student. So World War I broke out when he was an undergrad at Yale, and every member of his Yale class volunteered to join the U.S. Army at that point, and then went off to Europe. Now, can you imagine the members of the Yale undergraduate class, answering that?
We don't need Zoomer slander here, okay? There's, who knows what the threat would be from the Gen Z crowd at Yale. That's fair. I'm going to challenge you on that point a little bit, though. I absolutely hear what you're saying about kind of the national fervor of what's happening in Ukraine. But I think that there's been a sort of reanimation of kind of a pan-Western, sort of unity and behind Ukraine, and you see this across Europe. Obviously, in some of the countries closer to Ukraine, there's a security element. But in France, I don't think that they're that concerned that Russia's going to march across Europe, and you I think saw the rejection of the nationalist wing there. I think in large part, I think Ukraine played a big part of that in the recent French election. Here in America, just kind of speaking to my peer group, I see a lot of people who are like, they want to volunteer, they want to contribute, they want to help. Maybe they're not applying to Ukraine to pick up, but there is this sort of sense that we might not share this nationalist or religious connection with Ukraine, but we do share something. It's this connection of a free people, and you know.
No, that's
maybe
absolutely
that
right.
Yeah.
No, in that respect, I think Ukraine has been really useful in reminding another generation that there are these kind of higher ideals that can bind a country together. So I want to make something really clear. I'm not in favor of national identity, just any old kind of national identity, right? The Hungarian kind or the Russian kind is really toxic because it is, you know, exclusive, aggressive, intolerant, right? So if you're going to have a national identity, I think it really has to be a national identity built around liberal values. And so we have to take pride in the fact that we're a free people. That's what Americans used to say about themselves, you know, we're a free people and we're proud of that freedom and we're willing to fight for it. And it has to be something that is equally accessible by the actual diversity of the people that live in your society, right? So you can't, like Viktor Orban has, say, Hungarian national identity is based on Hungarian ethnicity. Yeah. You know, that's kind of what people on the right, the MAGA right, want to do in the United States, and that's not the right kind of national identity. But I do think that, you know, there has been a tendency of certain liberals, you know, taking seriously the universality of human equality to dislike the idea of national borders and, you know, the idea that we're going to treat Americans differently from non-Americans. And, you know, I think a lot of that has kind of conceded the patriotism issue to the right where it shouldn't be. Because you're absolutely right. There's no reason liberal society can't, you know, feel this sense of national pride.
I agree with that. I just want to go on that kind of critique of the left a little bit, because that is frustrating with me as sort of an immigrant, I guess, to the left coalition now, having left my old party. You know, that came so natural at Republican events, this sort of patriotism. I understand the concern by people on the left about overdoing it, but I don't know. I traveled to Brazil last month, and I was as I was there on vacation, but I went to a festival while I was there, and it was a very, like, this American, it was all these American bands and American brands and American fashion, and really kind of the types of people that probably didn't vote for Donald Trump, right, as part of that were there for this festival. And I'm thinking to myself, the left really should be, there is an American cultural identity that is healthy, that does embrace diversity, that is not revanchist, right? And it does feel like sometimes the left is hesitant to sort of wave the American flag and say, you know, Doja Cat, and this is all of us too, right? Yeah. Like Apple is us, and you know, there are these elements that aren't, you know, about throwing back to the 50s.
If you ever want to be imbued with that spirit, you know, go to a naturalization ceremony.
Right, yeah.
They're very, very moving. In Europe, if you get naturalized, and in most European countries, it's actually very hard to get naturalized because they don't want you to be a citizen. But in the United States, you know, we typically have wanted immigrants to become citizens. And, you know, the governor will show up, there'll be a military color guard, everybody will say the Pledge of Allegiance, and it's a very, very moving ceremony. And I think it kind of, you know, so this is what I mean about a liberal national identity. My former colleague and mentor, Seymour Martin Lipset, used to say that you can't be un-German or un-Japanese because those identities are basically, you know, racially based.
Right.
But you can be accused of being un-American because American identity had become detached from ethnicity or religion or race and became a political thing that could be shared in terms of, you know, common love for the Constitution, rule of law, but also a broader culture in which, you know, and a lot of it was popular culture. So you think, what's defined America in the 20th century? Well, you know, the Great American Songbook, rock and roll, jazz, hip hop, you know, all of these incredibly vigorous cultural forms that, you know, have really defined what it means to be an American. And I think one of the really, even sports,
football, basketball, I was just going to say.
Right. So, like in all these World War II movies, there's a Nazi infiltrator, and you want to find out whether he's a real American, so you ask him
who the Cowboys quarterback is.
But unfortunately, you know, that's deteriorating.
Right.
And even in sports, you know, it's become politicized, and so, there's some sports that are red and some that are blue, and I think that those cultural icons, unfortunately, have seen some deterioration in recent years.
I agree with that. So then let's take that just then for a moment into what the right and left critiques of liberalism, and then we can kind of pick apart what's wrong with them.
Okay, well, so the right-wing critique is exactly what I just outlined, that it's not enough that you have a diverse civil society. They basically want to go back to an America that they imagined. For some of them, it's a Christian America. For some, it's a white America.
Monoculture.
Yeah, monoculture. I think this is kind of a fantasy because, right, in the 19th century, everyone may have been Christian, but the Protestants hated the Irish that were coming in, and so on and so forth.
Nobody told the black people about the monoculture, I don't think.
Right. And now you've got these conservative intellectuals like Adrian Vermeule and Patrick Deneen and so forth that are toying with, integralism, where you basically have a state religion that's backed by the power of the state. That's a kind of extreme version, but I think that hankering for that kind of, deeply rooted national identity is one of the things that they don't like about the current, diverse America. And on the left, it's pretty understandable. Liberalism is based on the rule of law. It's highly procedural, and therefore it's very slow. And so, just to point out one glaring example, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments after the Civil War, in theory, give African Americans equal juridical rights to white people. But for the next 100 years, you still had Jim Crow, and it's only until the Civil Rights Movement that the legal segregation gets wiped away, and that's pretty slow, progress. But it is progress, but it's slow. And I think, anyone interested in social justice wishes that it would be faster. But you got a system that protects property rights, and therefore you're going to protect the rights of oligarchs and rich people as well as ordinary ones, and that's a problem. And on the left, that's a problem in their eyes.
So how are you seeing that left critique manifest?
Well, so it's not just the slowness of the system, it's also a questioning of the liberal premise of kind of under the skin we're all human beings, because there's a couple of versions of identity politics that have appeared as a redefinition of what it means to be a progressive. So one version of identity politics is actually just liberalism in a different form, where you have a marginalized group, African Americans, women, gays and lesbians, so forth, that say, we've been excluded, we're mistreated, we want to be treated equally. And so that's a liberal understanding of identity. But there's an illiberal one that says, those identities are so essential to who we are that we, deny the individualist premise, that's the thing that you ought to look at first, when you're apportioning out resources or hiring people for jobs and so forth. And, that's the point at which it becomes, potentially illiberal, because you're judging people based on a group characteristic and you're giving rights to groups rather than to individuals.
I thought this was maybe the most interesting part of the book, is it's put some language around a problem that I've been having, because I'm gay and have a black daughter, and so there are elements of identity politics that resonate with me, right? Like the representation elements, right? That it's like hard for my mom to go find my daughter a black ballerina toy, right? Yeah. It's like, it'd be nice to have some black, the representation would be nice. I think I see her and like looking at, black women who are seeing things. This is good. Like it's something that I think does have value. Pete's candidacy. I wrote a lot about Pete's candidacy, and I felt like people undermined how important that was. It was kind of like crazy to me, thinking that it didn't even occur to me that I could get married when I was in college, and now like a married gay man is running for president. Like that has to have an impact on college. So I thought all of those elements of identity politics are good. Well, at the same time, there's this obvious pernicious element to identity, to identitarian politics that I think is causing some of the right-wing backlash. And how do you kind of navigate that line?
Well, so this is kind of the larger theme. So you asked me what's wrong with liberalism, so we're finally getting to that. And I think that, it's not, liberalism as a theory itself, but interpretations of liberalism that have been carried to extremes. And one of them on the right has been the evolution of liberalism into what's called neoliberalism. The market is good, so 10 times as much market is going to be 10 times better, and the state is an obstacle to, markets working efficiently, so let's get rid of the state. I mean, that's one of the things that's led to the kind of inequality in the United States. But on the left, you have a similar evolution where you say, well, autonomy is a good thing. Basically, all of us want to be free agents and want to be respected for that. But, under the certain liberal thinkers want to carry that to say autonomy is, is the be-all and good-all, end-all of human life, and it doesn't matter what you choose as long as you've chosen it. So it's not just your ability to follow the rules as established by a religion or culture, but you get to make up the rules, yourself, and that in a way undermines every existing moral tradition that people have, and people actually don't want to be completely autonomous free agents that can, like Nietzsche, Zarathustra, just make up a new moral order. They actually want to live their lives according to orders that have been existent before them, that their ancestors practiced, and so forth. And there's a version of liberalism that says no, you have to start from zero. You get to decide everything. So I think that's
Yeah, you get into this is I want to get this right, so I made a note of this. You get into this sort of tension in the book, right, that you're talking about now, this liberal value of individual rights, but then a critique of, I think what you referred to as Rousseauian individualism, right? This sort of, which is what you're getting at now, right? Where it goes too far, and this idea that American culture has developed now has replaced, some of those kind of uniting kind of values with individualist pursuits, I don't know, self-care, yoga, what is it, the lived experience, kind of these cliches of modern life. But I guess I was just what struck me is okay, but when does that become problematic, right? I don't, at an individual level, if somebody that wants to find community through these sort of self-care and pampering, like that's not. Is there anything that's like fundamentally wrong with that in a free society?
I don't think there's. It is just an aspect in a way of liberal choice. Right. Where it does become dangerous, I think, is when it becomes a matter of public policy and a kind of formal way of distinguishing groups. And so, if you think of a liberal society not as a collection of free individuals, but a collection of, sort of closed groups that are competing with one another, that becomes a very, problematic sort of society. And we have a lot of examples of that around the world. Political scientists call it consociationalism. As we speak, Lebanon is melting down because it's a very diverse society. But, in Lebanon, you don't act as an individual, you act as a member of a particular, sect, and all the political positions are given out based on which sect, the Speaker of the Parliament, the President, they're all given to different people. That's a very, very extreme example. But I think that to the extent that you can maintain a liberal order that is based on individuals rather than on formally recognized group rights, that's a better way to proceed.
Again, if you have questions in the audience, you can write them on note cards for on YouTube. You can put them in the comment section. I want to do a little bit more on the philosophy here when we get into politics at the end. So if you have questions about Rawls, now's a good time to get those up here. I want to backtrack a little bit to your neoliberal critique, which kind of caught me off guard, I guess, in the book. Just how I think that you argued how central it was to the backlash to the discontents, to the liberal order. You said at one point there was an intellectual capture of economists by big business, and the income inequality and various elements of neoliberalism has brought about this backlash. So because I think that a lot of people, I sort of put classical liberalism and the sort of free market neoliberalism viewpoint as hand in hand, and I guess you were sort of arguing that they've been in conflict, or actually almost undermining it rather than conflict.
Well, I think if you only have a liberal society, it's probably not sustainable if you don't connect it to democracy in some way. And by democracy, I actually mean you have to equalize outcomes to some extent, because if the inequalities become too extreme, the whole system loses legitimacy. And I think, liberal societies have saved themselves by allying to democracy and doing a certain amount of redistribution. But in the 1980s and 1990s, that fell out of fashion. There were a lot of attempts to cut back the state, to cut back regulation. And if you want to trace, just a clear, line, you look at the deregulation of the financial sector. Of all the parts of a modern, late capitalist society, the one part that absolutely has to be regulated is the financial sector. But, under the influence of neoliberal ideas, those regulations were taken off, beginning in the late 80s and then culminating in the late 90s. And that led directly to the financial crisis in 2008. The banks were allowed to take these really enormous risks, and millions of Americans lost their homes in the subprime mortgage crisis. And if you look at the people that created this system, they did fine. A year or two of turmoil, and they're back to being on top of the world, masters of the universe, and so forth. And so I think you can see, the anger at the way that those elites had managed the system, and it was a justified anger, I think.
Okay, so this is your critique of the neoliberal order. We have an audience question here. I'm going to ask you to put your hat on the other side, which is to defend liberalism in the heart of an economic question. This person argues liberalism leads to unfettered capitalism and the concentration of wealth in the 0.1%. And I think this is the left-wing critique of economic liberalism, and that is inevitable. Like, what is the argument against that?
Well, like I said, I think that liberalism, if that's all you had, if we had liberalism with no elections and no voting, you'd end up, that critique would be right. But the successful instances of liberalism were ones where it was paired with democracy. And, beginning in Bismarck's Germany, but certainly at the beginning of the 20th century, most democracies actually began putting in social protections of various sorts, welfare states that guarded people against some of the extremes of market capitalism. And I think that liberalism survived. Friedrich Hayek wrote this book called The Road to Serfdom, where he wanted to make a slippery slope argument that the moment you start regulating this free market, it was inevitable that you're basically going to end up like the Soviet Union, that it would keep getting, more and more state, less and less human freedom. I, in general, don't believe slippery slope arguments, but that one in particular proved to be wrong. I actually think that social democracy in Europe was what saved liberalism, because it did equalize outcomes, and it kind of raised all boats, even as the society, the wealthy were getting richer. So, that's a true critique, but we do have democracy as well.
I've got two audience questions here that kind of pair together about the challenges of liberalism in a modern age. The first says Americans no longer share the same sources of facts and arguably reality. Can liberal democracy survive the digital media? The other question to the same point is, as the concepts of liberalism continue to adapt in the modern age with social media, how do you think the idea of true liberal politics will take root in the next generation? So it's two challenges. How can these values in the next generation, and is it hopeless given the fake news? And
I wouldn't say it's hopeless, but I don't actually have an answer to that question. I think it's a really serious challenge. So there are several levels to this. One of the chapters in my book talks about the decline of this, what I said was a cognitive mode closely associated with liberalism, which is modern science. And in my view, that critique actually begins on the left. I actually studied with these people when I was young and foolish. I spent, a better part of a year in Paris studying with Jacques Derrida and these post-structuralists. But there's a line that goes from structuralism to post-structuralism to postmodernism to different versions of critical theory, a lot of which is a critique of science. It's a belief in a certain kind of subjectivism, and it kind of culminates in the work of Michel Foucault, who, very brilliantly makes a critique of science in which he says there are these categories that use scientific language about incarceration, homosexuality, mental illness, that actually are not scientific. They're simply using that language to manipulate you. These are elites that are using the language to manipulate you, and what he called biopower permeates, the whole of society. And I think a lot of the sensitivity to language that is at the core of political correctness really comes from Foucault, because he said that it's really language that is used by these elites to do this. And so, in my view, he was really one of the original conspiracy theorists, that he actually said that science in many respects was a conspiracy that was manipulating ordinary people. And now that has drifted over to the right, where the whole critique during COVID was of the public health establishment. And, you hear these Foucaultian strains that these people are not, they claim to be scientists, but they're really elites that are using science to manipulate you because all they care about is power. So you take that view of science and you combine it with the internet, and you've got a big meltdown, right? Because the internet at least had these filters where there were certain standards for verification, legacy media, in the science community, in the legal community, in criminal law. You couldn't just say anything you wanted, but, with the internet, anyone can say anything they want. So you go on the internet and say, "Are vaccines safe?" and you'll get 10,000 hits saying, no, that's completely wrong. That's, they're pulling the wool over your eyes. And how you get out of it is, it's a question. We actually have a new center in my institute, a cyber policy center, and so people have been trying to wrestle with this for the last several years, and I don't think that there's a good answer to this.
Me neither, but I'm not here to give my dark thoughts. I want to move to the right and the concerns about the right, but just one more thing on the left, since you mentioned that. And I think this kind of Foucaultian mindset sort of led us here on the critical to where we ended up on critical theory. We have this question, which is, what is the most charitable construction that can be given to claims such as math is inherently racist? And I think that you see this criticism from the critical left, right, which is all manner of liberal values, all manner of things that you've been talking about, not just math, but the scientific method, that they're Western, they have this inherent racist element of them. What is the response to that critique, and what is the most that takes their critique seriously?
Well, in this book, I actually tried to be fair to critical theory, and so I actually go over several, especially the early writers like Charles Mills or Carol Pateman, so forth, were actually steeped in, Western political theory, and they understood it well, and they make serious charges against liberalism, which I don't think are right, but they're serious people. The problem is that you get these Robin DiAngelos and Ibrahim Kendis that, have a kind of cartoonish version of this, where you say that, in fact, we had a presentation at a seminar at Stanford where some woman was saying, she was critiquing racist Western epistemology. I mean, Descartes is somehow an instrument of white power, it's just completely nonsensical sort of thing. But so there's no charitable account of some of these, latecomers that really turn it into a caricature of itself. But there is something to the, the earlier critical theorists that said there are many ways in which, existing institutions and structures, appear to be liberal and open and tolerant, but they really do, hide a more covert form of, of power that keeps certain people in positions of power. And, I think you can probably identify a number of them in criminal justice and, a lot of domains of life. And so that part of it, I think, is okay. Where it goes wrong is where it attacks the principles of liberalism itself. It attacks, freedom of speech, due process, the premise that, there's a basic moral equality to people. Those are the points in which, I think it veers off into something that I certainly am not going to defend.
For sure. So let's now kind of level set, because I want to get into the right illiberalism, which that seems more acute to me. But for you, when you look at those threats, and if we say, if we're defining the threat of the illiberal left being kind of the critical theory, the right being this sort of Trumpist, and it's in a raw sense, and maybe in a more scholarly sense, the Vermeule integralist theory. Like what do you, if we're doing a threat assessment, of the next quarter century? How do you look at those two different strains of illiberalism?
Well, to me, there's absolutely no question that the threat, the clear and present danger, is coming from the right. And it'll come in the 2024 presidential election. I was just listening to Bill Kristol's latest podcast with Judge
Luttig. It's
yeah.
really good.
It's really scary.
Yeah, it's really scary because Luttig was not like a Trump derangement, never Trumper like me. I mean, he was very,
very conservative.
Yeah, very conservative.
And I think he said a number of things that were absolutely correct. That, and January 6th was not a spontaneous rally that just got out of hand. That's the way I thought about it initially when I was watching it on TV. But now we've learned through the January 6th Commission that it was planned very carefully, that, that Trump was behind all of it, and that basically a lot of Republicans want to be able to repeat it, making use of this Electoral Count Act of 1887, this very defective law, in such a way that they can substitute their will for the will of the people in a future election. And that is just the most overt threat to democracy that, certainly I've seen in my lifetime. And so that, is by far a clear and present danger. The one on the left is complicated because it's a cultural threat. It exists primarily in elite institutions in the arts, in Hollywood, and universities, and it's slower acting. And actually, the big controversy among with my more progressive friends is a lot of them say, it's not that serious. It is just a few incidents that get blown up by the conservative media, and everybody thinks that there's no freedom. In fact, I've got conservative friends that assert, there's no freedom of speech whatsoever in a place like Stanford. It's ridiculous, You can say whatever you want.
We live in the golden era of speech. This is my biggest pet peeve about the complaint about the left-wing liberalism. Like cranks, people like Diamond and Silk, who, would be writing letters to the editor, to their local paper, and having them be rejected 25 years ago, now have like 1 million followers on social media. There are certain threats within these elite institutions to, employee speech, but political speech is thriving.
Yeah. Well, and the threats are really narrowly related to certain civil rights issues having to do with race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. But, in this country, you can say anything you damn want about the President of the United States or anyone else, in power. I had
to listen to like 3 conservative podcasts about how Dave Chappelle was being canceled while I was like driving by a Dave Chappelle billboard about how he's going to fill the stadium in New Orleans. So it's like, are we sure he's canceled? It seems like he's doing pretty good to me.
Yeah. But just to be fair,
sure.
I see this in a lot of my students, that they don't have liberal attitudes towards a lot of things, and they're going to inherit the country at some point. So, it's worth worrying about.
Fair, worth worrying about. I want to go into the more acute threat because we're out of time. But obviously, there are a couple things happening in the news that are very relevant to your book, and I just want to speak about it. The first, obviously, this replacement theory, great replacement theory, which is about as illiberal as you can get, that led to the shooting in Buffalo. But then we have these kind of Republican primaries going on right now, where extremely illiberal Republican the J.D. Vance candidacy in Ohio, and that all ties together. A lot of them sort of use soft replacement theory language. So, just putting Trump is a unique individual threat, but putting him aside for a second, what about these other kind of elements on the right?
Yeah, well, it's terrible. I mean, you know, not only was January 6th planned, but in a way the worst thing is then the Republican reaction, which should have been one of shock and horror and the marginalization of the people that were behind the conspiracy. But instead, they've tried to normalize it, they've tried to defend it, you know, essentially sweep it under the rug. And as a result, you know, you got more than 30% of the country that thinks that Biden is not the legitimate president. And it's really hard to see how you can have a constitutional democracy when that many people believe something that's just a total lie.
Yeah, and I mean, Vance, who's going to be in the Senate, was likely Senate candidate, was feted by all of the elites that are such a threat to speech. I don't know if you saw in a Vanity Fair article, he literally went so far as to say that, you know, Trump should conduct extra legal firings of government officials, and if the Supreme Court tries to stop them, say, send your army. Yeah. I mean, that's very scary rhetoric coming from a competent this is someone who I think would have a more competent ability to enact anti-rule of law efforts, and that isn't really related to Trump, right?
No, that's right. I mean, the whole party is now, you know, fallen in line behind that kind of rhetoric, and the damage that can be done in a second Republican presidential term after 2024 is just enormous.
How do you tie? So this is one of the questions from the audience or from online. Perceived victimization, as proffered by a demagogue, also foments friction among groups. And so I think in some ways these things are acting together, right? There's this sense on the right. There's this victimization of white culture, right? We're being targeted, you know, affirmative action, et cetera, and then, you know, it's that sense of victimization is being hypercharged by a demagogue. You know, leading to some of the things, maybe not directly leading to some of the things like Buffalo, but certainly leading to the radicalization of young men. You know, like what, you know, how do you kind of break up that sort of symbiotic sort of relationship, this feeling of victimization?
Well, I wish I had a simple answer to that.
And we have 2 minutes left for you to solve that problem.
I guess my basic answer in general is that you win elections. You know, that the people that believe that stuff are not a majority of the country. And, you know, if you play your political cards right, you can marginalize them politically. It's just that right now, I just don't think the Democrats are doing a really good job in, you know, organizing themselves to really focus on what's important and to persuade. You know, one of the scariest things is, as a political scientist, I believe, and you know, Tim, I know you believe that, you know, this threat that's posed by, you know, this January 6th stuff is like the biggest danger that we're facing in the near future. Yeah. But most Americans could care less, you know. It's kind of an elite concern, and somehow nobody has made it clear to them that they could lose their entire democracy if this stuff isn't stopped.
Can we talk about the elite right then? And this is a little bit more of our world, right? We live in this world, and you know, more from a kind of a public and electoral standpoint, me from like the campaign hack perspective. But like, what is your sense when you talk to folks, you know, that share your classically liberal values, have been traditionally in line with the Republican Party, who just don't share that threat assessment, who kind of look at what is happening with the Republican Party and decide that, whatever, cancel culture is a bigger threat? Like, how do you diagnose that? Like, what, you know, do they have a legitimate reason for their lack of concern?
So a long time ago, I decided that, you know, this premise that people are fundamentally rational was a very naive point of view, and that actually social psychologists, you know, had better insight into why people believe what they do, you know, that it has to do with social pressure and social acceptability and this enormous ability of human beings to pursue what is called motivated reasoning, where you use your cognitive ability not to actually try to perceive the objective world, but to make the objective world fit your wishes in terms of what it should be like. And that's a lot of what's been going on. But I must say, I mean, one of the strange experiences, this started really with the Iraq War, where a lot of my close friends were big boosters of it and, thought it was a really great thing, and I didn't. And I just didn't understand, given that we all had very similar backgrounds and knowledge, why is it that certain people change their minds and other people don't? And I still don't know what the reason is.
I want to do one other political timely thing. Obviously, we have potentially the Roe v. Wade overturn coming in the next few weeks. You wrote a little bit about this, about kind of how abortion is a challenging question within this construct of liberalism, the equal right to autonomy, the mother and the child. What is your kind of sense for how people that want to espouse classically liberal values but maybe have differing specific views about the origin of life, like how can we as a group here at the Commonwealth kind of navigate those differences in a liberal way, and what's your sense for what's coming?
Yeah, I'm not terribly optimistic about how this is all going to play out, because it does seem to me that, because of the way this issue has been politicized and has politicized the judicial system, I don't think that you're going to get satisfactory answers coming out of that. I mean, there was a time when you might have hoped that the judiciary had, maintained enough independence that people would actually listen to reasoned arguments. I think it's been long since, so again, I think this.
There was a classically liberal argument, right, on the right for a while that overturning Roe v. Wade would lead to this sort of, how a liberal democracy is supposed to work, right, where there is, federalism and you find common ground and certain limits. But it feels hard to imagine that's going to happen.
Hard to imagine, and it's also the case that there's a strong common law tradition that's, supporting stare decisis. And if people think that something is a right for 2 generations, and even if there are questions about the original decision, you can't just take it away from them. And so, I think we're in for a tough period where this is going to be fought out politically.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes left. I'm going to get to 1 or 2 more audience questions. My last thing about this, just to challenge you, the book does talk about, to this portion, talk about federalism and sort of the value of this and maybe protecting kind of the liberal order by, sort of pushing more decisions down. My concern about that is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence and maybe this is related to the communications questions, right? That our small communities are at all. There's a buffer at all from these sort of illiberal trends, right? And the kind of illiberal national trends that we see in Congress are being, paralleled or even worse in certain cases in various state legislatures and community organizations. So, how is your sense that maybe that's okay, right? That there's federalism and that there'll just be different outcomes in different places, or what makes you think that sort of pushing decisions closer would help?
Well, it depends on the kind of issue that federalism is meant to address. So there are a lot of issues that are purely local, like building infrastructure or, running police departments or so forth. And I think that it's too bad that a lot of them have gotten nationalized in, the way that people think about them. Part of that has to do with the disappearance of local news, because that used to be a buffer where, people could talk about things within their community without that being tainted. But not everything is related to politics that comes out of Washington. There still are a substantial number of decisions that are taken locally, where local people have better understanding. The place where you get into trouble, again, is where you get into these basic rights issues, having to do, and that was classically the reason that the federal government would overrule states' rights. Right. Southern states wanted slavery, and then after the end of slavery, they wanted Jim Crow, and that was a uniformity that the basic structure of our rights dictated, be centralized and be made uniform. On the other hand, healthcare policy. Does everybody in the country have to get an identical level of care? Can it be tailored to rural communities or urban areas? Is that sort of thing is that an area where you don't necessarily need to have a federalism, a single policy dictated from Washington? And I suspect, probably not.
This is kind of just now taking the whole conversation into a broader context. We've been talking about the concerns about liberalism, but it is, I thought this audience question was interesting, that maybe there's an inherent instability in the nature of liberalism that just needs to be embraced, right? It's given the human nature of pursuing social hierarchy for power. Is there always going to be, these sorts of ebbs and flows, in any sort of liberal country?
Well, I wouldn't.
Society.
I don't construct a whole theory around it, but there's something to that. That in many ways liberalism is desirable when compared to its alternatives, and I think it's still the case that none of these critics on the left or the right has come up with a convincing substitute for liberalism. But, people do get complacent, and we've been living in a liberal world order since 1945, a lot of it constructed by the United States, where people could assume a basic level of peace and prosperity. And, they wanted the liberal order after 1945 because they saw what war could do. In Eastern Europe, they saw what communism meant, and they wanted to join the European Union because they didn't like that kind of dictatorship. But now in Poland, for example, you've had a whole generation that's grown up, no living experience of communism, and so they can believe that it's the European Union and not, a communist guy or a dictator like Putin that's the real danger. They don't believe that in Poland now, but you could have this illusion of safety. And so I do think that there may be this cycle, unfortunately, that we do have to go through where you experience all the alternatives to liberalism, and then you begin to realize that peace and prosperity and stability was actually pretty good, and you need to fight and you need to be vigilant in order to keep it.
Yeah, well, we'll close with this. I kind of bristled at this line in the quote. You paraphrased Churchill with, liberalism is the worst form except all of the others. And I felt like after writing this compelling defense of liberalism against its discontents, that was like a little bit of self-hating about all of this, and that maybe hopefully coming out of this, especially with what's happening in Ukraine, we can kind of sort of re-foster some enthusiasm and excitement for these principles, and that maybe we could be in a moment for that, right? Where with everything that's happening in the world, and I think even growing frustration on the left with some of the liberalism. I'm less hopeful on the right; they seem to be embracing it. But there could be this moment of sort of reinvigorating moment of classical liberalism. So do you have a closing note of hope for us on that?
Okay, I have a closing optimistic note on which to conclude. If you look historically at the most successful societies in history, let's say beginning with Periclean Athens, but going through the golden age of the Netherlands in the 17th century, or England inventing the Industrial Revolution, or fin de siècle Vienna that produces Mahler and Hofmannsthal and Sigmund Freud and so forth. Liberal societies are really the founts of creativity and historical progress, right? Precisely because they are diverse and revel in that diversity and allow people to do what they want. And I think, when I think about the United States, its culture, it comes out of that diversity. Like, I just think, I listen to a lot of music. If you listen to American music in the 19th century, it's pretty horrible. It's really boring. Yeah. In fact, the Calvinists didn't even like people singing. And then, you get to the 20th century and you think about all the musical forms, Great American Songbook. It's all written by Jews, that were first generation immigrant, Irving Berlin and Dorothy Fields and, people like that. And then they meld that with African American music, with the blues. It becomes rock and roll. Now it, evolves into hip hop. what it is to be, to have an American culture really does come exactly out of that diversity. And we should be proud of that, right? That's a great achievement. It's conquered the world. You go to these really obscure parts of the world, like I do pretty regularly, and what do you hear? You hear American music. So,
can we put Coachella culture on a bumper sticker? This is it, right? This is a unifying factor. It was really an honor to do this. Thank you so much, and thank you to the Commonwealth Club for having me. Do I have a closing thing? I want to thank everybody who joined us here. Thank everybody online. Thank Ken and the Jacqueline Broad Fund for its support. This program and others are going to be found on commonwealthclub.org. I'm Tim Miller. Thank you all so much. Program is adjourned. We'll see you in July.
thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.